Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something I think a lot of us can relate to on some level. It's that feeling when you find yourself stretched, just incredibly thin. You're trying to keep your own life upright, but you're also throwing every single ounce of energy you have into supporting someone who's navigating some deep emotional chaos.
Some real trauma.
Exactly. And you get to this point, this unsustainable strain, where the lifeline you're offering out starts to feel a bit like a noose around your own neck.
It's the ultimate ethical and, practical balancing act. I mean, we're constantly told to have compassion, to be there for people.
Of course.
But we're so rarely given the actual structure, the instruction manual for how to sustain that compassion without completely collapsing ourselves.
And that's exactly what we're getting into today. We're doing a deep dive into a really powerful stack of sources that treat this whole dynamic emotional support recovery less like some, spontaneous act of heroism.
Boy, less like a feel-good movie.
And more like a rigorous, disciplined, almost like an engineering project.
That's a great way to put it. It's about building a stable structure.
So our sources, they give us this dual focus, which I think is incredibly helpful. They use two very clear archetypes. First, we have Paul. He's the dedicated helper who, through what you could call extreme self-sacrifice,
Unintentionally, of course.
but unintentionally becomes the single point of failure in his own life. And then on the other side of that, we have Eunice. She's the individual grappling with severe trauma, instability, and a profoundly negative and, frankly, destructive worldview.
And our mission today is pretty surgical. We're looking to extract precise, actionable insight for both sides of this really complex equation.
Not just one side.
Not at all. The strategies are rooted in strict personal boundaries, a kind of philosophical self-mastery, and really concrete daily routines.
So for you listening, whether you see yourself more as Paul, the exhausted caregiver, or maybe you relate more to Eunice, the person trying to rebuild from the ground up,
This deep dive provides systems. That's the key word. This is all about applying discipline systems from high-level philosophy all the way down to what you do every single morning to protect your mental and emotional health.
on all sides.
On all sides. The goal is to make sure that recovery, whether it's for the helper or the person being helped, is actually sustainable.
Okay, let's unpack this enormous burden, starting with Paul. His situation is, it's not just stressful. The sources describe a systemic breakdown.
It really is a total system failure.
He carried the entire household burden, and the result wasn't long-term stability for anyone involved. Instead, it just led to the total deterioration of his own structure.
His own foundation.
Exactly. His sobriety was compromised, his finances cratered, and his emotional balance was just shattered.
So what does his story tell us right off the bat about the real cost of unlimited compassion?
It tells us that compassion, when it's exercised without principle, without boundaries, it degrades into self-immolation. It's a fire that consumes the person giving the warmth.
Self-immolation. That's a strong phrase. It is, but it's accurate. Paul, by shouldering absolutely everything, he became the victim of his own, admirable intentions.
Of course, his intentions were good.
The best. But the sources highlight that this immediate, visceral desire to solve every single problem for the person who's suffering. It's a fundamental failure of foresight. It's an unsustainable burden that inevitably turns the helper into a second casualty.
Which then means?
Which means the person they were trying to help in the first place is now left without any resource at all. You've created two problems instead of solving one.
So the first big takeaway, the first principle we have to internalize is, compassion does not require self-immolation.
It cannot.
But that phrase, even though it's necessary, it can sound a little cold, can't it? I think a lot of people feel that setting limits is the same thing as being selfish or abandoning someone right when they need you the most.
Absolutely. It's a huge cultural script we have.
So how does the source material draw the line? How does it differentiate between setting a necessary boundary and just, walking away when things get tough?
That's the critical distinction, and the sources are very clear here. They define this boundary not as a matter of your personal comfort, but as a moral and a practical necessity. And they introduce this concept of the cable tow.
The cable tow.
It's an old term, but the idea is powerful. It isn't just about feeling tired or stressed. It is the clearly defined moral and a physical limit beyond which your act of helping becomes actively self-destructive.
Okay, so define that for me in practical terms. What does it actually look like when Paul crosses his cable tow?
It's the point where extending help compromises your integrity or your core functionality. So for Paul, he crossed it in at least 3 distinct areas we can see.
Let's hear them.
First, financially. If helping Eunice pay her rent meant that he defaulted on his own car payment, that's crossing the cable toe. He's now destabilizing his own life to temporarily stabilize hers.
It's a net loss for the system.
A total net loss. Second, his sobriety. If the constant stress of managing her chaos led him to relapse or even just to seriously consider it, that is a massive crossing of the cable toe. His own recovery is non-negotiable.
And the third?
Morally. This one is subtle but so important. If he started lying to his employer to cover for being late or lying to other friends to hide how much he was overextended, he's now compromising his character. He's acting out of integrity.
So once Paul crossed that limit,
He guaranteed the deterioration of his own stability. It was no longer a question of if, but when. He lost his footing, and suddenly, he wasn't just supporting Eunice from solid ground. He had jumped into the pit of chaos right alongside her.
the cable tow then, it's like an early warning system.
Exactly. It's designed to protect the source of the help itself.
And this protection, it has to begin internally. It's not just about external actions. The sources say it starts with this philosophical root, prioritizing the inner citadel.
Precisely. This is drawing on some really deep ancient wisdom. The idea is that you have to maintain your ruling faculty, your mind, your reason, as tranquil and invincible.
The inner citadel.
It's your command center.
Yeah.
And if your command center falls to chaos, your ability to act rationally, to act morally, to act effectively at all, it just vanishes.
But that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How in the world do you maintain this invincible core when the external world is just screaming at you?
Yeah.
When Eunice is in an acute crisis, the external pressures must be incredibly intense.
They are, and the philosophical exercise the sources prescribe is simple, but it's really rigorous. When other people's chaos, their job loss, their frantic phone calls, their despair, when all that tries to breach your citadel,
Yeah.
you have to consciously remind yourself that things external to your mind have no inherent relation to it. They can't touch it unless you let them.
So the trauma and the job loss,
Yeah.
they belong to Eunice.
They belong to her. Your job is not to internalize her pain, but to manage your reaction to her pain. The practice of recovery, even from something like caregiver exhaustion, involves looking at things as you ought to look at them.
Which means what exactly?
It means applying truth to the emotional pressure. The truth is, I can only control my response. I can't control her outcome. By doing that, you maintain a clear mind, a mind that's actually capable of providing effective, rational help instead of just emotional noise.
That reframes stress completely. It's not the event that's hurting you, it's your judgment, your internalization of the event.
That's the core of it.
So protecting the mind is boundary number one,
Mm-hmm.
and that has to translate directly into the world of action. The sources give some very specific guidance on the actionable boundaries Paul has to enforce.
Yes, and they're all framed around integrity, because integrity is the foundation of the citadel. The source gives us 4 specific compromises that Paul must absolutely avoid because they would guarantee his moral collapse.
Okay, let's walk through them.
He must not allow himself to be compelled by her or by his own guilt to break a promise he's made.
To himself or others.
To anyone. Second, he cannot be compelled to lose his self-respect. Third, he can't be pushed into a position where he hates any man, including her or himself. And finally, he must not act the hypocrite.
Okay, let's focus on that second one for a second, losing self-respect. In the context of the helper, that so often means just tolerating disrespect or sacrificing your own basic needs just to keep the peace.
It does, and it's a slow erosion. If Paul consistently lets Eunice treat him poorly, or if he continually sacrifices his necessary sleep or his financial security out of a sense of obligation, he loses self-respect.
And that erosion.
That erosion leads directly to what the sources call the mental effects that we need to stop. We're instructed to stop and limit those effects to their proper parts when we feel overextended.
What are those effects? Are we talking about the emotional warning signs that you've hit the cable toe?
Yes, exactly. Think of them as the internal toxins, the dashboard warning lights. They are rising resentment, debilitating fear, a kind of gnawing self-pity, and just utter bone-deep exhaustion.
So when Paul feels that resentment building, maybe he feels like he's giving 150% and getting nothing but grief back.
That's the moment. That's the signal to stop. He has to contain that feeling, recognize it, limit its scope, and immediately initiate a boundary reinforcement. Because if he doesn't, that resentment curdles.
It curdles into what?
Into the 4th cardinal sin on that list, hatred.
And this brings us to what might be the most difficult maneuver of all, Separation without hatred. How do you draw a firm, necessary line, maybe it means withdrawing support or resources, without that emotional backlash of hatred creeping in, especially when you're just so deeply frustrated with the whole situation?
You have to perform a cognitive reframing. It's an internal shift. You have to focus strictly on the principle, not the person.
The principle, not the person.
The purpose of the withdrawal, of the boundary, is preserving your ability to live a principled life, a life that is stable, sober, and financially viable. You are not rejecting Eunice as a person. You are protecting the principle of sustainable care.
So by framing it as a principled defense,
You remove the emotional heat. You take the moral burden of hateful rejection off the table. You can say to someone, I cannot lend you more money, not because you're angry, but because doing so would jeopardize my ability to keep my own commitments, and I must uphold that commitment. You can say it and mean it without hatred because the focus is on your own moral structure.
wow, that requires incredible rigor. It completely stops the helper from becoming a martyr.
Which is ultimately just a self-serving role disguised as compassion.
And it's another form of hypocrisy, isn't it?
It's the definition of it, and the sources explicitly warn against it. It means acting insincerely. If Paul keeps helping while he's boiling internally with resentment, he is acting the hypocrite. He's damaging his own citadel, and he's failing to provide genuine, principled help. The withdrawal, when it's done without hatred, is simply an honest recognition of a limit.
Okay, so we've protected Paul's philosophical core. But how does that translate into the chaotic reality of daily life, where crises are demanding immediate attention every 5 minutes? Let's transition into part 2, implementing systems and resilience for the helper.
Right now we get into the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of daily rigor. The struggle against external pressure is fundamentally an internal battle. It's a battle against poor time management and wasted mental energy.
And our sources champion what they call the battle against superfluous action.
Exactly.
Now, that seems a little counterintuitive when you're dealing with someone in trauma. Shouldn't Paul be constantly focusing on Eunice's needs? Isn't that the point?
No. Paul needs efficiency to survive. He can't afford waste. The consistent audit he has to perform daily, even hourly, is to ask himself this one question. Is this one of the unnecessary things?
And that applies to actions and thoughts.
Both. The thoughts are often more destructive.
So give me some examples. What are the unnecessary things that are stealing the energy Paul desperately needs for the actual necessary actions?
Okay, so unnecessary actions could be checking his phone for an update from her every 5 minutes, or doom scrolling through negative news while he's waiting for his coffee to brew, or reorganizing a file cabinet for the 3rd time this week when he has an overdue bill to pay.
It's busy work that feels productive but isn't.
It's distraction. And the unnecessary thoughts are even worse. Worrying about some hypothetical future where Eunice is permanently homeless, mentally rehearsing arguments that he's never actually going to have with her, dwelling on past mistakes he made. The mind loves to inflate the scope of necessary involvement.
So by ruthlessly cutting out this mental and physical clutter, you achieve something really crucial.
You gain leisure and less uneasiness. The sources are almost mathematical about it. They guarantee this. By taking away superfluous acts and, just as importantly, unnecessary thoughts, Paul gains mental bandwidth. He gains the leisure to check his own arrogance, to be superior to pleasure and pain.
He frees up cognitive load.
A huge amount of it. Cognitive load that was previously just being wasted on speculation and low-value tasks. And that recovered bandwidth is what he can then use to support Eunice rationally without the emotional strain and burnout.
That is the ultimate efficiency hack. And this conserved brain capacity, it needs to be managed rigorously. Which brings us to the power of routine and mantras.
Indeed. Our cognitive capacity, our ability to make difficult, stressful decisions, it's a finite resource. It's like a battery that drains during the day, so we have to automate the small stuff.
And developmental triggers, or mantras.
Yes, to override that immediate emotional resistance that causes procrastination and those negative thought spirals.
I often hear people say they trust their planning routines, but when the stress really hits, they just revert to chaos. The plan goes out the window.
And that's exactly where the mantra comes in. It acts like a tiny command prompt for the stressed out brain. So if Paul is feeling too overwhelmed to stick to his necessary weekly budget review, his internalized mental trigger, something like trust the process, should fire automatically.
It's a little override switch.
It completely bypasses the emotional, panicked brain and enforces adherence to the routine. The routine itself becomes the master, not the momentary feeling of being overwhelmed.
And these routines have to extend to the most basic recurring tasks.
Absolutely. The sources remind us that routines like, always filling your gas tank when it hits a quarter full, or
Hmm.
reviewing your bank balance every single morning, checking your calendar, they become habits that are done without conscious thought.
They become automated.
And that automation conserves that precious brain capacity. So when a real crisis hits, Paul isn't distracted by, oh no, did I pay that bill? Or do I have enough gas to get to the ER? All that mental space is conserved for the high-level, difficult decisions that Eunice's chaos is demanding from him.
That is such practical wisdom. It's all about efficiency.
Yeah.
But let's be real. When Paul is facing burnout, sometimes the only solution is delegation, asking for help. The sources are clear that seeking help is not a weakness.
It's a sign of profound strength. A person who confesses they are overloaded is acting strategically. They're recognizing their limits and they're initiating fixes to the system.
And there's an unexpected psychological benefit, isn't there? The sources highlight that sometimes just the act of explaining the problem helps you solve it.
It's fascinating. When Paul explains the depth of the chaos to a third party, even a friend who's not an expert, the act of articulating the problem helps him solve it.
It's the famous rubber duck debugging principle from programming, but applied to trauma care.
Precisely. You have to translate this confusing emotional tangle of Eunice's situation and his own stress into coherent chronological language. And that process forces internal processing. It imposes structure on the chaos. Even if the listener offers zero advice, the process of articulation often reveals the solution to Paul himself.
And since we're focused on rigorous high-stress management, let's talk about system administration self-care. This isn't about bubble baths and spa days, is it? This is professional risk mitigation.
It is exactly that. In a field like system administration, a high-stress field, you learn very quickly that the administrator themselves is the most critical component in the system. If they crash, the entire system fails.
So self-care moves from being a luxury to a maintenance necessity.
Non-negotiable maintenance. And this includes the basics like rest and relaxation, getting adequate sleep, prioritizing physical health. These are not optional.
And then exploring practices like yoga, meditation, massage. Really setting aside dedicated time for mental hygiene.
Yes, and these aren't frivolous. They are intentional tools for down-regulating a nervous system that has been chronically activated by stress. But the most robust and maybe the most difficult to implement piece of advice here from the sources is the necessity of vacations.
Okay, explain the organizational coverage angle on this. How does Paul taking a long vacation actually help Eunice in the long run? It seems like the worst possible time to leave.
The sources specify that long vacations are necessary not only to relieve his stress, but to serve the practical business function of testing organizational coverage and documentation.
So in Paul's domestic system, he's become the sole documentation and coverage plan.
He's everything. He's the help desk, the finance department, the emotional support. So if he leaves for 2 weeks, what happens to the system?
It might just collapse immediately.
And if it does, that proves the system was fatally flawed to begin with. His chronic stress was a symptom, not the core problem. The vacation forces essential structural fixes.
So before he leaves, he has to.
He has to document routines. Where is the key to the emergency fund? Who does Eunice call if she needs immediate transportation? He has to delegate access to financial or legal contacts. If the system survives his absence, it proves it's robust. If it collapses, the vacation provides incontrovertible evidence of where the unhealthy dependencies lie, and that forces a long-term fix to the codependency that was slowly destroying him. It's an essential, proactive self-audit.
That completely shifts the moral pressure away from Paul. His goal isn't ceaseless presence, it's structural resilience.
Exactly.
Now, even with all these boundaries, Paul's consistent actions, they still have a powerful influence on Eunice. This is where we talk about the power of the small candle of truth.
Yes, his moral consistency acts as a kind of therapeutic agent, even when he's upholding really strict limits. His influence comes through, and the sources say, consistent actions, decency, and restraint.
So Eunice, who is grappling with this deep negativity and these destructive internal beliefs, she's operating from a worldview that assumes chaos and selfishness are just the rules of the game.
That's her reality. She assumes everyone is dishonest, everyone is out for themselves.
And Paul's life, lived by his principles, provides a living counter-argument.
Exactly. By maintaining a life that is simple, good, pure, serious, free from affectation, and a friend of justice, Paul provides living proof against those destructive assumptions she holds. He doesn't need to preach at her, he just needs to be. He demonstrates that stability and moral consistency are actually possible.
The goal, then, isn't to fix Eunice through more self-sacrifice, but to provide an influence that slowly, maybe imperceptibly, changes her inner bias, her mind, from doubt to faith, from fear to courage.
It is just by being a reliable, principled force in her periphery.
And the strength of the boundary is the strength of the influence.
That's the paradox. If Paul's boundary wobbles, his proof fails. If he maintains his citadel, he is the unwavering candle in the dark for her.
Okay, now we need to shift our focus entirely. We turn to Eunice, and her path is much darker. It's more internally complex. She's dealing with deep trauma, depression, job instability, and a highly destructive internal life.
And the sources are very specific here. It includes hatred and, significantly, finding gratification in the suffering of others. This is a massive internal disorder that requires true reform.
It does. And her path has to begin with a really deep philosophical realization, taking ownership of the soul.
Eunice has to internalize the concept that her destructive behavior isn't just her lashing out externally. It's an act of self-violence.
The soul of man does violence to itself. That is a brutal but incredibly powerful realization to come to. How do her specific behaviors, the hatred, the insincerity, how do they constitute violence against her own soul?
They violate her fundamental nature as a rational and social being. The constant memory that's required here is that the soul injures itself in three primary ways. First, when it turns away from any other person, isolating itself through judgment or hatred.
Okay.
Second, when it is overpowered by pleasure or pain, allowing external events to completely dictate her internal stability. And third, when it acts insincerely or hypocritically.
So her hatred, her gratification in others' suffering, they are profound acts of self-alienation.
Absolutely. The mind's mandate, according to the sources, is clear. Focus only on what is according to the nature of the rational and social animal.
Let's break down that rational and social animal concept for Eunice.
Yeah.
Why is hatred, from this perspective, irrational?
Hatred is irrational because it damages the hater far more than it ever damages the hated. It locks the hater into the past. It consumes enormous amounts of emotional energy that should be directed toward productive, rational effort.
And it's unsocial.
Deeply unsocial because it severs the natural cooperative link between human beings. Eunice's recovery involves understanding that her duty is toward the greater community, and by hating, she is fundamentally working against her own rational design and her own social purpose.
And this leads to a critical tool for her to overcome that hatred. Understanding ignorance and error. When you are the one behaving destructively or you see it in others, it's so hard not to just resort to moral condemnation. I'm bad or they're bad.
And the sources offer a form of radical compassion through philosophy here. When Eunice acts destructively or harbors hatred, she must remember that this unsocial or wrong behavior, it often stems from ignorance of what is good and evil.
It's not necessarily intrinsic malice.
No, it's a fundamental, deep-seated error in judgment, an error that's likely been driven by her trauma and by misinformation she's absorbed about the world.
So the source says every person who errs misses their object and has gone astray. If Eunice can realize that her inability to hold a job, or her self-sabotage, or her hatred of Paul's stability isn't wickedness, but that it's an error, a profound miscalculation of where goodness and stability actually lie, what does that change about her internal task?
It changes everything. It changes the task from, I must fight my own evil nature, to, I must seek knowledge and correct my error.
A completely different problem.
If the hatred is an error, then the solution is consistent action toward truth and structure. It removes the paralyzing shame that so often accompanies trauma and destructive behavior. Instead of asking, why am I so bad? She can start asking, where did my judgment go astray, and what knowledge do I need to correct it?
That sounds like a necessary but just an incredibly difficult psychological shift to make. And to even begin that shift, Eunice needs resilience, which means accepting a very hard truth, accepting suffering as bearable.
This is maybe the most challenging instruction for someone who is deep in trauma. They feel completely defined by their unbearable suffering.
Of course.
But the sources provide this incredibly powerful assurance. Nothing happens to any man which he is not formed by nature to bear.
Okay, how does this philosophy differentiate between the pain that paralyzes you and the pain that might serve a purpose?
The sources make a very practical, almost clinical distinction. Intolerable pain, they argue, carries one off. It's fatal. Therefore, if Eunice is still alive, if she's still functioning at even some minimal level, the pain is, by definition, tolerable.
But the real enemy isn't the pain itself.
The real enemy is imagination. The sources say that pain that lasts a long time is tolerable if you add nothing to it in imagination.
The imagination is that internal narrative. The voice that takes a moment of difficulty and spins it into a lifetime of unavoidable misery.
It's the catastrophic thinking.
Right. It turns a single failed job interview into the story of, I will never succeed and I will die alone.
Exactly. And that amplification is the true source of unbearable suffering. The philosophical instruction is to quarantine the external event from the internal narrative. The pain itself is a fact. The story you tell yourself about the pain is optional.
And even better, you can reframe adversity. Use the suffering to exercise another virtue.
Making the hindrance a furtherance to an act.
So the loss of a job isn't just a loss. It's an opportunity to exercise the virtue of persistence, or meticulous job searching, or financial discipline. The difficulty becomes the raw material for building resilience.
It ceases to be an obstacle and becomes the gymnasium for her moral muscle. And because this work is so profound and so painful, the sources underscore the absolute necessity of finding strength in faith and hope to anchor the whole effort.
For someone who is deeply depressed and full of doubt, what does this faith provide, practically speaking?
Practically, it provides the stability and the assurance that her own internal structure currently lacks. The difficulties of life, the ruffling storms and swelling seas of her emotional chaos, they can be steered through by faith, hope, and love.
So trust in God and hope will be.
Will be as a tree planted by the waters that shall not wither, even when the heat of emotional distress or external difficulty comes. It's the external anchor she needs to hold on to, while her internal structure, built of these daily habits, is slowly and painfully repaired.
Okay, so Eunice's philosophical framework is now set, but she's still stalled by this functional instability. Her trauma has manifested as inertia. She can't hold a job. She can't start necessary tasks.
And the root of that inertia is so often just fear and self-doubt.
That fear of failure keeps the person paralyzed, which makes the problem worse, which increases the fear. It's just this horrible feedback loop.
A vicious cycle.
To break it, the sources offer a simple, powerful way to build self-esteem. The poker chips analogy.
Right. Self-esteem is described as a stack of poker chips. Eunice starts with very few because her trauma and her failures have completely stripped her deck. She can't wait for some huge win-like landing a dream job to suddenly get a mountain of chips.
It's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. She has to consciously create more chips through positive, incremental daily action.
So instead of aiming for get a high-paying job immediately, which is this massive high-stakes gamble, she focuses on small, guaranteed wins.
Precisely. Making the bed, sending just one, carefully proofread resume, showing up to a short appointment on time, successfully completing a chore she's been dreading.
And every single one of those.
Every single positive, intentional action, no matter how small it seems, adds one chip to her stack. Overcoming self-doubt in a tiny moment like saying no to the urge to snack unnecessarily, that adds a chip. Accepting quiet, principled support from Paul without self-recrimination adds a chip. The sheer volume of small successes replaces the paralyzing fear of big failures.
This shifts the entire focus from grand achievement to daily movement, which brings us to the core mandate for combating instability, the power of just start and consistency.
This is the fastest way to succeed, the source material argues. Just start. Do not wait for a perfect block of time or for perfect motivation or a perfect plan. Just start.
Because procrastinating takes longer than the action itself.
So much longer. The mental energy you spend agonizing over the task, managing the guilt about not doing it, worrying about the hypothetical outcome, it far, far outweighs the energy needed to simply execute the task for 5 minutes.
It's the initial psychological friction. This is the real energy drain, not the task itself.
Right. And since the goal here is stability, stability relies on habit. And the sources give us this foundational rule. It takes about 21 days of consistently doing a new behavior to develop it into a genuine habit.
So commitment is non-negotiable.
Non-negotiable. Eunice has to commit to the routine for 3 weeks, knowing that the first week will feel completely unnatural, the second will feel difficult, and only by the end of the third will it begin to run on autopilot, which is what conserves her precious brain capacity.
And to protect that consistency, the sources offer a really practical prioritization tip. If something absolutely has to be done every day, like looking for work, taking medication, exercising, do it early in the day.
This is vital for stress reduction. If Eunice puts off a necessary task, let's say her primary task of job seeking, The psychological weight of that undone item just drags her entire day down. It consumes bandwidth, it compounds stress, and it invites a spiral of failure.
But by tackling it first thing in the morning,
She has added a guaranteed chip to her stack, she has reduced her stress for the rest of the day, and she's freed up all the rest of her mental energy for other things.
but no matter how good the planning is, failure is inevitable, especially in trauma recovery. Eunice is going to stumble. How does she deal with those mistakes without just reverting to self-hatred and shame?
She has to implement a blameless culture toward herself. It's a concept from high reliability organizations, a way to handle system repair.
Mistakes are not moral failings.
They are data points, that's all. The focus must immediately shift away from self-recrimination, I'm lazy, I'm a failure, and on to system repair. What went wrong with my system?
So if she forgets to follow up on an important job application, the fix isn't self-flagellation. The fix is structural.
Exactly. The fix is implementing a permanent countermeasure. Okay, I'm going to use a specific digital reminder for this next time. I'm going to set a specific time slot on my calendar that cannot be ignored, or I'm going to ask Paul, who is now maintaining his principled boundaries, to hold me accountable to the system, not the outcome.
And the sources emphasize spiritual purification alongside this.
They do. If she has done wrong, she must confess her sins and forsake them. This means owning the mistake, seeking forgiveness where necessary, and then immediately amending the future by implementing the fix. It's a dual commitment to moral reckoning and systematic repair.
And as she rebuilds her life, fixing these errors and building these systems, the energy needs to be directed outward. This brings us to the commitment to the larger purpose.
This is what moves Eunice out of the small circle of her own immediate suffering and back into her rational social nature. The sources remind her, we live not only for ourselves but for others, to serve ourselves, our families, our friends, neighbors, and country. Love is ever the builder.
And that purpose provides the fuel that mere survival often lacks.
Exactly. When her personal motivation flags, remembering that her stability benefits others can be the thing that restarts the engine.
The ultimate goal, then, requires the perfection of our intelligence and an advancement toward a true understanding of duty. This sounds like a lifelong, difficult task.
It is. The sources say it requires the sincere pain taken to find out truth. Eunice has to recognize that wisdom, the clarity she gains through discipline, self-correction, and understanding of principle, is the very channel by which virtue is directed. Her recovery is not a vacation from duty. It's the prerequisite for her to fulfill her duty to herself and to her community.
Okay, so we've seen these two highly disciplined, rigorous paths emerge. Paul's path is the principled defense of the inner citadel and the cable tow. Eunice's path is the incremental, consistent rebuilding of her life through small habits and inner reform. Both demand structure and focused intent.
And they are mutually dependent. Paul cannot help if he collapses. Eunice cannot stabilize without the model of Paul's principled, stable action. And to help anchor these really complex concepts, our sources offer two brilliant guiding analogies, starting with the archaeologist for Paul, the helper.
I love this analogy because it immediately reframes the helper's role. You're not a heroic rescuer. You're a professional manager of fragile resources.
Precisely. The helper is a seasoned archaeologist who is preserving a delicate ruin. That's the struggling individual. The ruin needs care, yes, but the archaeologist's primary responsibility is to diligently manage their tools, their resources, and their own mental focus.
Because the archaeologist works carelessly.
They damage the ruin further. If they work past their own physical or mental limits, they risk a total structural failure of the site.
And this ties back directly to the cable tow.
It's the crucial detail. The archaeologist must know exactly where to stop digging. That is the boundary, the cable tow. If they dig too aggressively or in a compromised area, the entire site can collapse right on top of them. And if Paul collapses, all his previous excavation and preservation work is rendered completely futile. The boundary is an engineering requirement for site preservation.
Okay, and for Eunice, the analogy shifts. Because the rebuilding house. This recognizes that trauma isn't just an emotional state, it's a structural disaster.
A catastrophic earthquake has hit her life. And the first step is not immediate construction. The first step is stability. You have to stop the trembling. You have to manage the acute trauma and the emotional instability so that the foundation can even be reassessed.
And once the ground has stopped shaking, the rebuilding requires laying each living stone firmly and consistently.
And those living stones are the small habits, the daily truths she embraces, the incremental small victories we were just discussing.
The poker chip.
The poker chips. The strength of the final structure, the rebuilt house, relies entirely on the dedication of each daily effort. not on some grand, miraculous, instant blueprint. If Eunice skips her 7 a.m. check-in, that stone is loose. If she adheres to her 21-day routine for building a habit, that stone is set firm. The strength comes from the volume and the consistency of these small, dedicated actions.
So ultimately, these two roles, the helper and the fellow, they both rely entirely on disciplined self-management. Paul needs his own foundation to be a steadfast resource, and Eunice needs to be the disciplined builder of her own new structure.
That's the synthesis.
We've covered an incredible amount of terrain today, demonstrating how structure and a kind of philosophical rigor are really the only paths to sustainable recovery and support. For Paul, it's all about the cable tow, the inner citadel, and treating self-care as necessary system maintenance.
And for Eunice, the pathway is defined by owning the violence of the soul, reframing suffering as bearable by limiting that destructive imagination, and overcoming inertia with consistent, small actions. The 21-day rule, just starting, and embracing a larger duty. It's how we turn chaotic emotion into manageable, measurable effort.
So here is a final provocative thought for you to carry forward, one that ties these two perspectives together. The source material is explicit that Paul, the helper who is setting boundaries, must separate without hatred. Yet, we learn that Eunice's destructive behavior stems from ignorance, not from malice. So if you as the helper apply the principle that the person you are setting boundary with has simply gone astray, how does that shift the emotional weight and the difficulty of upholding your own cable tow?
What happens when you substitute your judgment of their failings with the understanding that they, too, have merely missed their object and are struggling in error? Consider that this cognitive substitution might be the very practice that allows you to uphold the boundary, your inner citadel, without resentment or hatred ever taking root.
A profound thought on principled compassion. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time.